Every pattern you repeat or every choice you can't explain and every version of yourself you keep returning to has a blueprint. Welcome to the Echo Principle, where we map the unseen architecture of human behavior. If you think carefully, you belong here, so drop a like and make sure to subscribe to our channel. In 1847, a doctor in Vienna figured out how to stop women from dying in childbirth. He had the data. He had the evidence. He had mortality rates that dropped from 18% to below 2% the moment his solution was implemented. And the medical establishment responded by destroying him. His name was Ignaz Semmelweis. And what happened to him is not just one of the most tragic stories in the history of medicine. It is a precise and almost unbearably accurate map of something that happens inside every human brain when it encounters a truth it was not prepared to receive. We call it the Semmelweis Reflex. The automatic, instinctive rejection of new information when that information contradicts what a person, an institution, or an entire culture has already decided is true. Not a considered rejection. Not a rejection based on examining the evidence and finding it wanting. A reflexive one. Visceral. Immediate. The kind that happens before rational thought has had a chance to enter the room, and before you tell yourself this is a story about other people, about lesser minds, about a more ignorant era, I want you to hold that thought. Because the research on this is unambiguous. The Semmelweis reflex does not correlate with low intelligence. It does not correlate with poor education. In many of the most well-documented cases throughout history, it correlates with the opposite. The smarter the person, the more elaborate the defense they can construct against an unwanted truth. The more credentialed the institution, the more sophisticated its capacity for dismissal. This is a story about the architecture of belief. And it starts in a maternity ward in Vienna with a man who was almost certainly right, and a world that was absolutely not ready to hear it. The Vienna General Hospital in the 1840s had two maternity clinics. They were physically adjacent, staffed by the same institution, serving the same population of women. And they had dramatically different mortality rates. The first clinic, staffed by medical doctors and students, had a mortality rate from childbed fever, what we now call puerperal sepsis, that regularly exceeded 10% and occasionally climbed toward 18%. The second clinic, staffed by midwives, had a mortality rate that hovered around 2%. Women in Vienna knew about this difference. There are documented cases of women begging not to be admitted to the first clinic. Of women choosing to give birth on the street rather than enter that ward. The disparity was not a secret. It was a source of institutional shame that everyone acknowledged and nobody could explain. Semmelweis became obsessed with it. He was a young Hungarian physician, methodical and relentless, and he began systematically eliminating explanations. Overcrowding. Ventilation. Diet. The position women gave birth in. One by one, the alternative theories collapsed under scrutiny. None of them explained why two adjacent clinics with such similar conditions could produce such dramatically different outcomes. The answer arrived not from careful observation in the ward but from the death of a colleague. A pathologist named Jacob Kolechka was accidentally cut by a student's scalpel during an autopsy and died of an infection that Semmelweis recognized immediately as identical to childbed fever. And in that moment the pattern locked into place. The doctors and students in the first clinic were coming directly from performing autopsies to delivering babies. The midwives in the second clinic never performed autopsies. The doctors were carrying something from the corpses to the mothers. Something invisible. Something that, in 1847, had no name yet. Semmelweis introduced mandatory handwashing with a chlorinated lime solution between the autopsy room and the maternity ward. The mortality rate in the first clinic dropped from 18% to below 2% within months. The data was not ambiguous. It was not subtle. It was one of the most dramatic demonstrations of a life-saving intervention in the history of medicine. The response from the medical establishment was rejection. not reluctant skepticism. Not a request for more data before drawing conclusions. Rejection. Ridicule. Professional hostility of a kind that seems almost incomprehensible in retrospect, but that makes complete sense once you understand the psychology driving it. To accept Semmelweis's conclusion, the doctors of Vienna would have had to accept something that their minds were structurally unprepared to process. That they were the cause of the deaths. That their hands, moving from corpse to patient, from autopsy table to delivery room, were the vector. That the institution of medicine, which defined itself by its commitment to healing, had been systematically killing the people it was supposed to protect. This was not just a new idea. It was an identity-destroying idea. And the human mind does not evaluate identity-destroying ideas the same way it evaluates neutral ones. It does not weigh the evidence dispassionately and update its beliefs accordingly. It mobilizes. It defends. It attacks the source of the threatening information with a ferocity that is directly proportional to how much is at stake in being wrong. The leading obstetrician in Vienna, Karl Edward Mayhofer, dismissed Semmelweis without examining his data. The professor who controlled Semmelweis's academic position refused to support his work. Colleagues who had initially shown interest quietly distanced themselves as the professional cost of association became clear. What Semmelweis experienced was not simply professional disagreement. It was a systematic institutional campaign to preserve a belief system against the evidence threatening it. And to understand why, we need to go inside the psychology of belief perseverance. Belief perseverance is the documented tendency of people to maintain their beliefs even after the evidence supporting those beliefs has been thoroughly discredited. It was formally studied in a landmark experiment by Lee Ross, Mark Lepper, and Michael Hubbard at Stanford in 1975. Participants were given information supporting a position. They formed a belief. Then they were told explicitly that the information was false, fabricated for the purposes of the experiment. Their beliefs did not change. Not significantly. Not reliably. The belief, formed on the basis of evidence that participants now knew to be false, persisted. Because by the time the correction arrived, the belief had been integrated into a web of other beliefs, of self-concept, of social identity. And removing it would require dismantling too much of the surrounding structure. This is what Semmelweis was asking the medical establishment to do. Not just to accept hand-washing, but to pull a thread that, if followed to its conclusion, would unravel the entire fabric of how those doctors understood themselves, their profession, and their relationship to their patients. The thread was this. If invisible particles from corpses cause disease, then disease is not caused by miasma, by bad air, by the mysterious imbalances of bodily humors that medicine had built its entire theoretical framework around for 2,000 years. If Semmelweis was right about mechanism, then virtually everything the establishment believed about disease causation was wrong. That is not a small concession. That is the demolition of an entire worldview. Here is the detail about Semmelweis that most retellings leave out because it complicates the clean narrative of the misunderstood genius. He was not easy to dismiss because his evidence was weak. He was easy to dismiss because of the way he presented it. Semmelweis was not a diplomat. He was not politically skilled. As the rejection of his work continued and the deaths continued and the data kept accumulating, he became increasingly erratic. He wrote open letters to prominent obstetricians calling them murderers. He confronted colleagues in public. His behavior became more extreme as his frustration mounted, and his deteriorating presentation made it easier for the establishment to focus on the messenger rather than the message. This matters because it reveals something important about how the Semmelweis reflex actually operates in practice. It rarely takes the form of an explicit statement that the evidence is being ignored. It takes the form of procedural objections, methodological concerns, Questions about the presenter's credibility, their demeanor, their failure to follow proper channels. The substance of the claim is never directly engaged. Instead, the circumstances surrounding the claim are used to justify not engaging with it. This is what psychologists call identity-protective cognition. The tendency to evaluate evidence not on its merits but on whether accepting it would threaten one's identity, status, or group membership. And it is extraordinarily effective precisely because it looks like rational scrutiny. It performs the gestures of careful evaluation while doing something entirely different underneath. Semmelweis's critics could always point to something. His failure to publish promptly. His confrontational letters. His emotional instability as the rejection mounted. Each of these things was real. And each of them was used as a reason to not look at the data. In 1865, Ignaz Semmelweis was committed to a mental asylum. He was 47 years old. He died there 2 weeks later, possibly from the same type of infection he had spent his career trying to prevent, contracted through a wound sustained during the admission process. He died without seeing his work vindicated, without receiving the acknowledgement that the evidence so clearly warranted, without the satisfaction of knowing that the practice he had introduced, handwashing as infection control, would eventually become so foundational to medicine that its origin story would have to be actively taught to prevent it from disappearing into the background of assumed knowledge. Louis Pasteur's germ theory, published after Semmelweis's death, provided the theoretical framework that explained the mechanism Semmelweis had identified empirically. Joseph Lister developed antiseptic surgical technique using Pasteur's framework. The medical establishment embraced both with considerably more enthusiasm than it had offered Semmelweis. Because by then the identity threat was different. Accepting germ theory did not require the living doctors of 1870 to accept that they personally had killed their patients. It required accepting a new scientific paradigm, which is uncomfortable, but survivable. The specific, personal, accusatory nature of Semmelweis's finding that these doctors, with their contaminated hands, had been the vector, was gone. And without it the resistance melted away. This is a pattern that appears consistently throughout the history of paradigm-shifting discoveries. The resistance is not primarily to the new idea. It is to the implications of the new idea for the people being asked to accept it. Change the implications and you change the resistance. The Semmelweis reflex is not a historical artifact. It is not something that happened to less enlightened people in a less enlightened time and has since been corrected by the advance of scientific thinking. It is happening right now. In medicine, in economics, in climate science, in nutrition research, in psychology itself. In every field where established practitioners have built careers, identities, and institutions on a particular set of assumptions, the arrival of evidence that contradicts those assumptions produces the same pattern. Procedural objections. Methodological concerns. Focus on the credentials or character of the researcher rather than the data. Slow institutional response that trails the evidence by years or decades. The replication crisis in psychology, which began gaining serious attention around 2011, revealed that a significant proportion of the most cited findings in the field could not be reproduced under controlled conditions. The response from many established researchers followed the Semmelweis pattern with uncomfortable precision. The methodology of the replication studies was questioned. The motives of the researchers conducting them were scrutinized. The implications for the established findings were minimized. Not by everyone. Many researchers engaged with the crisis honestly and productively. But the institutional resistance was real, documented, and entirely predictable once you understand the psychology generating it. The problem is structural. Peer review, the mechanism science uses to evaluate new claims, is conducted by the peers most invested in the existing paradigm. Grant funding flows toward established frameworks. Academic careers are built on the citation of previous work. The entire infrastructure of knowledge production is designed, inadvertently but effectively, to make paradigm-challenging evidence harder to publish, harder to fund, and harder to take seriously than evidence that confirms what is already believed. Now let us bring this into your life. Because the Semmelweis reflex does not limit itself to institutions and scientific paradigms. It runs in every human mind, including yours, in the specific domains where belief is most entangled with identity. Think about the last time someone presented you with evidence that directly contradicted something you believe strongly. Not a trivial belief. A belief that is connected to how you see yourself, how you understand your past decisions, how you make sense of the world. What happened in your body before your mind started evaluating the evidence? There was probably something physical. A tightening. A resistance. A subtle but unmistakable sense of threat that arrived before any conscious assessment of whether the evidence was actually good or bad. That physical response is not a malfunction. It is the immune system of identity doing exactly what it evolved to do. Protecting the coherence of the self against information that would require significant internal reorganization to accommodate. The problem is that this immune system cannot distinguish between a genuine threat to the self and merely uncomfortable information that happens to be true. It responds to both with the same defensive mobilization. And in doing so, it ensures that the people who most need to update their beliefs are the least likely to do so. Research by Ziva Kunda on what she called motivated reasoning showed that people are genuinely capable of evaluating evidence objectively when they have no stake in the conclusion, and genuinely incapable of doing so when the conclusion threatens something they care about. The same person, the same reasoning capacity, completely different outcomes depending on whether the truth is convenient. There is a specific and recurring pattern in how new truths are received that the historian of science Thomas Kuhn mapped in his landmark 1962 work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Kuhn argued that science does not progress through the gradual accumulation of evidence within a stable framework. It progresses through periodic revolutions in which one entire framework is replaced by another. And those revolutions are almost never smooth. The old paradigm does not yield to evidence. It yields to generational replacement. The scientists who built their careers on the old framework rarely convert. They continue defending it, with increasing procedural sophistication and decreasing engagement with the actual evidence, until they retire or die. And the new paradigm takes hold not because it wins the argument but because a new generation of scientists, without the same identity investment in the old framework, builds their careers on the new one. This is Kuhn's most disturbing finding. That in science, as in most human endeavors, belief change at the institutional level is driven less by rational persuasion than by the biological fact that people eventually stop being alive. Semmelweis died not knowing he was right. The doctors who dismissed him died not knowing they were wrong. And the handwashing that saves lives every day in every hospital in the world carries no monument to the man who discovered it at the cost of his sanity and his life, because the story of how it was received is too uncomfortable for the institution of medicine to make central to its self-narrative. This is the final operation of the Semmelweis reflex. Not just the rejection of the new truth in the moment, but the subsequent rewriting of the record to minimize the evidence of the rejection. So what do you actually do with this? Knowing the mechanism exists. Knowing it runs in you as surely as it ran in the doctors of Vienna. Knowing that your most strongly held beliefs are precisely the ones where your capacity for honest evaluation is most compromised. The first thing is the hardest. You have to develop what the philosopher of science Karl Popper called falsifiability as a personal practice. Not just as a scientific principle but as a habit of mind. For every belief you hold with significant confidence, you need to be able to answer the question honestly: what evidence would change my mind? Not what evidence would I find convincing after the fact. What evidence, encountered in advance, would I accept as sufficient to update this belief? If you cannot answer that question, if there is no conceivable evidence that would change your mind about something, that is not a sign of intellectual strength. It is a sign that the belief has been removed from the domain of rational evaluation entirely and placed in the domain of identity. And identity beliefs are the ones the Semmelweis reflex protects most fiercely. The second practice is learning to notice the physical signal. That tightening, that resistance, that subtle sense of threat when contradictory evidence arrives. And to treat it not as confirmation that the evidence is wrong, but as information that the evidence has touched something important. That it is worth slowing down. Worth actually engaging with rather than finding procedural reasons to dismiss. Semmelweis had the data. The data was right. And an entire institution looked at that data and found reasons to look away. The tragedy is not that they were evil. The tragedy is that they were human. Exactly as human as you are. Running exactly the same machinery you are running right now. The difference available to you, the one that was not available to them, is that you know the machinery exists. Here is the closing thought that I want to leave you with. Every truth that is now obvious was once dangerous. Dangerous not in the abstract but specifically dangerous to the people who held power within the framework the truth was about to displace. The earth moves around the sun. Disease is caused by microorganisms. The universe is billions of years old. Children need emotional attunement, not just physical provision. Trauma leaves biological traces in the body and the brain. Each of these ideas, now so embedded in our understanding that they feel self-evident, pass through the same gauntlet. The ridicule. The procedural objections. The focus on the character of the person making the claim rather than the claim itself. The long delay between when the evidence became clear and when the institution accepted it. And in each case the people doing the rejecting were not stupid. Were not malicious. Were, by the standards of their time and their field, among the most educated and sophisticated minds available. Running the Semmelweis reflex at full force. Protecting a framework that had served them well. Doing what human beings do when a truth arrives that they were not ready for. The question that history keeps asking, and that each generation has to answer fresh, is whether any individual within a resistant institution can develop enough awareness of the mechanism to step outside it. To look at the data the way Semmelweis looked at his mortality tables. With the willingness to follow the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of what it says about the people doing the looking. That kind of intellectual courage is rare. It is uncomfortable. It costs something real in the social and professional currency that human beings run on. And it is, without question, how every truth that matters has ever made it through. This has been the Echo Principle. Make sure to drop a like and subscribe if you enjoy unmapping the dark mysteries of human behavior and psychology.